Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. This is the captain speaking. Just about ready to depart. Should be away on schedule.
Hi, my name is Kapil Amarasinghe. I'm a UK Community Ambassador for the Particl project. I'll quickly explain what everything is and leave the questions to the end. So just to start with, what is Particl? Particl is an emerging e-commerce platform and network that essentially enables the buying and selling of goods and services without any need for personal information to transact. It's a fully private system. There are no trusted third parties required. Okay? Now, how do we actually enable this? Now, there are multiple parts to this solution, but the bit I'm here to talk to you today is our Escrow Service, which is actually very unique to us. It only uses two parties, the buyer and the seller. There are no intermediaries with our Escrow Service. Now, contrast this to the traditional escrow where you've got a buyer, a trusted intermediary, and a seller. We effectively, I should have a strike through where that trusted intermediary is, but there is a buyer and seller, that's it. Now, how does this work? Right, that cup of coffee, which is currently used over there, I may wish to sell that to someone in South Africa. What I do as a seller, I access the Particl network, put a listing for that cup of coffee on the Particl network, then a potential buyer in anywhere in the world sees that listing for that cup of coffee and they go, I want to buy it. What they then do is, as the buyer, they bid for that cup of coffee at whatever its listed price is, and then put a deposit as well that's equivalent to the value of that item. The seller,
the full value.
At the moment, the full value. For the current iteration, the full value. We'll get to that at the end. So at the current iteration, it's the full value, 100%. The seller, likewise, when they list that cup of coffee, they also put a deposit in equivalent to 100% of the value of that cup of coffee for this iteration. Okay? If the transaction is successful, i.e. I send that cup of coffee to that guy and he receives it and says, yeah, it's a great cup of coffee, then we both agree that that transaction's gone through, and then me as a seller, I get that money that was given by the other guy, and I get my deposit back, and the buyer gets his deposit back and a cup of coffee. However, if either the buyer or the seller does not agree that the transaction was successful and a resolution cannot be reached, then both the buyer and the seller lose their deposit. So again, if for whatever reason that cup of coffee doesn't go through, me as the seller, I sent it, got lost in the post. Well,
because it's tea.
Oh, tea, yeah. Exactly, because it's tea. Well, tough luck. I lose my deposit, and the buyer has not only lost the money they paid for that, but they lose their deposit as well. In this way, both the buyer and seller, without necessarily knowing anything about each other, are incentivized towards acting as honestly as they can. So as just a quick example, which is what I've already gone through, Joe agrees to buy a coffee mug worth of $50 from Ben. Joe offers $50 for the mug plus a $50 deposit. Ben offers the mug plus his own $50 deposit. If the transaction is successful, well, Joe gets the mug and a $50 deposit, his deposit back, and Ben gets the $50 from Joe plus his $50 deposit back. Bit expensive for a mug.
Yep.
So yeah, as I said, if either Joe or Ben do not agree the transaction was successful, then Joe loses effectively $100 and Ben loses $50 plus the value of his goods he was allegedly selling. So what are the pros to this? Well, as I said, Particl is a fully private network which requires no trusted intermediaries and no personal information apart from shipping. So this escrow means there's no trusted third party, therefore no commissions and no need to verify the integrity of your trusted third party because it doesn't really exist. It effectively enables transaction privacy. What's the obvious con? Well, liquidity. Both buyer and seller need to be able to afford the deposit and the associated risk of the penalty if the transaction fails. Okay, questions?
Where's my coffee?
Alibaba also has an escrow system. How does this differ from Alibaba?
So, the difference between Alibaba is you may still need to provide your personal information. With this, when you initiate buys and sells, at every single step of the way, privacy is built in. So at no point are you giving away your name, your date of birth, you're giving away a shipping address, but you don't have to give away your personal address. This is the opposite of traditional KYC compliance systems. It's a complete 180. So with Alibaba, you may wind up supplying them, or there may be a request to supply them because you're using traditional currencies.
So can we think of some domains where privacy is more valuable than others? Like if there were a scale, right? Now this is a money transfer remittance conference. I would imagine that privacy is somewhere in the middle to low end of a priority. I don't know. What do you all think? More directionally, right? And what would be some domains where privacy is really like up top priority?
Sure. So taking the Alibaba example, you've got so many manufacturers and vendors on there. If I'm a manufacturer and I'm looking to protect my intellectual property, so if I'm doing really high-end sophisticated research and development, this network sort of allows you to set up one-to-one private markets with every distributor. So if distributors migrate to this network and list their items, what they can effectively do is create markets on this network that only consist of the parties they want to be known. So, for example, if I'm a vendor of, I don't know, a certain engine type.
How about rocket-propelled grenade?
Yeah. It's a possibility. If you wanted an RPG, I'm not going to sit here and lie. If someone was ridiculous enough to offer an RPG, then I guess it's a possibility. What I'm going to say is this: there is governance systems built into this network. So if I create a market just between you and me, you know the address, I know the address. The minute that address for that market gets shared out, that market becomes more publicly known. Now anyone can then see those listings and then report them. And if when it gets reported, that enters a universal queue, which can then be looked up at. From a regulatory point of view, this network, much like Bitcoin back in 2012 and 11, opened up a Pandora's box. I think that's fair to say. You know, we are willing to work with authorities and regulatory bodies. You know, from an end-to-end point of view, in terms of how this sort of technology could affect KYC, all the transactions on this network are done in a native token called PARP. That's a digital currency which can be exchanged with Bitcoin or any other, or on cryptocurrency exchanges. So from KYC point of view, it really then puts the onus on cryptocurrency exchanges to really know their customers and what they're doing. And it puts a regulatory focus onto those exchanges. In terms of us working with authorities, without going too much into the technical aspects of this, the way the network is validated, all the transactions are validated, I can basically, this laptop, I could download the client software, put some of the native currency token and set it into a mode called staking, and then that laptop automatically starts verifying transactions on the network. Now, you know, these are discussions that will need to be had by this network or whatever network does this type of thing. And I will tell you right now, there are a couple of networks that have basically tried to copy this. I know that.
I think part of it too, when you're saying copyright, I know part of the inspiration for this is thinking of someone like Amazon, who their business model is pretty much like, oh, you're a merchant? Why don't you go sell your goods in our marketplace? And you're pretty much our beta testers. And once you're successful, we steal your idea and then we do it to scale and you're out of business. That's Amazon's business model. So that's not very inspiring to the small business owner who gets a short-term boost, but then pretty much gets undercut if they're too successful. And so I think the idea, right, to have no centralized authority, you have control a bit more of your marketplace and your transactions. And, you know, Facebook, these tech companies have been kind of under some scrutiny of the amount of power we give these companies, right, in terms of our data and our privacy and how they do their business models because it's free, but everything has a cost. And I guess here you're seeing the cost in the escrow price, but you at least have some more control over your data, and something like art or, where people do care about these things.
Is the patent the business model, the two-sided escrow, or is it the technology?
So it's fundamentally code. It's an open-ended technology which is for open source development. Any developer could go into the coding libraries. They're publicly available on the GitHub repositories. You can go look at them and you can start either developing for the Particl network, or you could lift some of that and create your own network that might be analogous.
So this is a common good.
This is a common good goal. This is exactly as I said, from a pure privacy-centric point of view. This is what we aim to do.
And I suppose better this than everything transacting on the dark web.
Yes, as I said, we have on-chain governance. We have a registered Swiss foundation. When we built this, we were being very explicit the whole time that this is not a dark web. Okay? We appreciate the potential for that, which is why we built in on-chain governance. It's why we built in on-chain reporting systems. That's why we have report queues. That's why it's why the foundation would be willing to work with appropriate regulatory bodies.
But just to clarify, that reporting is only if someone flags it.
If it gets flagged, yes.
So if nobody flags it, it is effectively a dark web.
If nobody flags that item hasn't been flagged. But what I'm going to say is you can't monitor. Let's look at global commerce from a real perspective right now. If you think of HSBC, they were involved in some huge money laundering business not that long ago. You can do illegal stuff with fiat. You can do illegal stuff with traditional money remittance services. You can't stop illegal stuff from happening. You can take the precautions required to make. And if you want a fully privacy-centric network, as I said, I'll tell you what, I'd like to hear your point of view.
Well, I think it is essentially a dark web. I mean, what you are describing here is exactly what you see on TV in startup.
So I would beg to
It's
disagree.
exactly that model.
So what I would disagree. A dark web doesn't have on-chain governance. A dark web doesn't allow you to flag things up.
No, but they had an internal record. So there was data kept. I mean, I'm with you. You just use this as RPG, this is code, this is...
For me, this is simply, if you're a manufacturer, you can have one-to-one markets with your vendors, and you can basically hide your manufacturing, your manufacturing supply chain from your competitors. If I'm developing commercially sensitive R&D, I don't have to worry about people trying to steal my patents and my technology to a certain extent because that's protected. If I simply am just if I just simply want to send some money privately without having to give up my personal data to a friend, that's simply done.
So just going back to the escrow point,
Yeah.
you sell me the cup of coffee, I put my $50 up,
Yeah.
I get the cup of coffee, but I dispute it saying I didn't get it.
Yeah.
So that's cost me $50,
Yeah.
it's cost you $50, and I've got the coffee.
Yeah.
So I win.
Well, no, you've lost $50. No, you
but
may
I've
have
got
a cup of coffee, but you've just paid twice over for the coffee.
No, I haven't.
Well, you've paid $50 plus a $50 deposit.
Right. Double settlement.
Yes.
So when do I pay the second $50?
You pay it at the time of purchase. So when the transaction's actually made, you pay the price of the item and the deposit, and the seller puts the deposit at the same time. So both are locked in, effectively. Both parties put a deposit at the point of sale. The funds are locked up until the sale has been agreed to have gone through. If either party doesn't agree, then both parties lose their deposits and the funds that they've locked up.
Now I see how Particl makes money. Anytime a transaction fails, you keep both sides.
If the let me explain. So every node is a validator. The more nodes that are in existence, If transactions fail, then yes, the sum total would get distributed across all the validators.
Who's a validator in this model?
So anyone who downloads the client software and says, right, I've set this to validate transactions on a network, they have a base amount of the native currency token which they store and set aside.
Some subset of the user group are mavens, they are the checkers, they are the...
Yeah, any of the users of the network can act as checkers and validators.
And they get little dividends once they found boo-boo or something.
So if transactions fail to go through completely, those get spread out. Transactions across the network, there's no commission on. So it's the way. Do you understand how Bitcoin works? So if I'm using Bitcoin and I send some Bitcoin to you, in order for that transaction to be registered on the Bitcoin ledger, a tiny fraction of Bitcoin is distributed effectively to everyone who's sort of trying to verify all the transactions on the network. So with Bitcoin, for example, sending money from party A to party B is not completely free. It's just supposed to be much, much cheaper than traditional remittance services. I won't get into the technical details because in practice it's not quite true, but with Particl it's the same thing. You have thousands of computers simultaneously verifying all of the transactions on the network at once, and they all have to come to the common agreement on what's going on.
So, applying Particl to remittances, instead of a cup of coffee, it's $100 bill, right?
You could post a $100 bill on this network, and you put the equivalent $100 value of deposit in part currency, that's sent across. Same thing.
What protocol is this built on?
So it's its own protocol called the Particl network. It's similar to Bitcoin or Ethereum. It's its own network.
And what's like your good? Do you have like a specific goods use case that you actually think this is really valuable for?
So
I can't figure out what that is still.
So the network doesn't take commissions on transactions. So if you think of companies like Amazon or eBay, Amazon does up to 40% commission on sales.
As a consumer, do I really care?
Well, if I was an Amazon trader and if I had my own private market on this, I could say, well, I could pass some of that saving on to the consumer and say, well, here's my Amazon page, but if you want to get the goods 30% cheaper, buy them here instead. I still make 10% more than if I sold on Amazon. So there are ways to make savings and ways for both buyers and sellers to win on this network.
So what's the revenue model then if it's not taking a commission?
So, as I said, everyone who validates transactions on this network, they get a slight reward in the native currency token. So the actual base supply, there's currently 9 million part tokens in circulation, and it's set to an annual inflation rate of around 3%, or go to 2% flat out per year. So everyone who agrees to validate transactions, what they do is they hold some part of their own, of the native currency token in their own laptop or on their own validating node, and it's validating transactions, and over a period of time they get given rewards in the native currency token for validating all the transactions. In addition to this, because it costs a small fee to transmit money, like it's a micro fee, so we're currently talking 7 cents, but if you cumulatively add up all those different transactions on the network, the sum total then gets divided by all the validators proportionate to how much the validators are staking.
So the Particl revenue model is that fee?
Yeah.
It's funny you guys asked me what to categorize you guys as a private company, a public company, and I was
We're not.
Yeah.
We're not. I don't work for the Particl Foundation. I'm just a community ambassador. I'm a volunteer. There is the Particl network. The closest analogy I can think of is the World Wide Web for e-commerce. No one owns it. There's a foundation that's based in Switzerland, but the developers are based in South Africa, Finland, Denmark, US, India, all over. People just build code for this network.
But just going back to a previous example, now I've got a shop, I sell coffee cups on Amazon, but I could also just have my own online shop, not Amazon.
Yeah.
So how is that any different?
Well, your own online shop doesn't have a commission, but then you've got to think that it's transacting again in fiat using banking fees, remittance. You have to then get all the other remittance services involved. With this network, everything gets done in a native settlement token.
So cutting out the middleman.
You're
but
cutting out every
double
middleman.
liquidity on both ends.
Yes.
You don't have credit risk on the buyer. Like the buyer, until the buyer pays you, you're out 500 coffee cups and haven't gotten your money yet.
And I've sucked up that liquidity.
In his model, the cost you have is the frictional cost is the
Equivalent to the value of goods.
putting up the money. The advantage is, versus having your own shop, you don't have to worry about people not paying you. That's cool. That's good.
I've actually had lawyers be interested for legal documents to use their service. When we were at Consensus, there was a few interested for that purpose.
How do you buy the crypto?
So the PART token's currently listed around 20 exchanges. So you could go to bittrex.com or any of the other exchanges that are currently listed and trade it. This actually has cross-chain interoperability built in. So when you build in the user interface, there'll be a point where you'll be able to just send Bitcoin to this network and it will just get converted to PART. And actually this can support a number of other cryptocurrencies for the same purpose.
There's no locked exchange rate. I know this is off topic, but
So there's a volatility
Bitcoin
risk.
and PART, right?
Yeah. So there's no locked exchange rate. Particle is not a stable coin. It doesn't have a fixed value. Its value is dependent on the demand. It's dependent on the supply by demand dynamics.
Right.
So there's a volatility risk. But if I go into the deeper aspects of that, it favors most people who adopt it.
Would you imagine in 10 years' time, or just in the future, that the prices quoted on a Particl e-commerce network will be quoted in PART or
So
traditional fiat currencies?
at the moment, the plan is to actually use an oracle to basically quote everything in fiat to begin with, but accepting volatility, I expect will move. It's a really tough question. I think it depends on whether the network becomes successful or whether a network like this grows and becomes successful. I think it's a very interesting concept. I think conceptually it can work. And this could be, in my mind, I could be representing 4 or 5 other companies with the same concept. In my mind, I see this as a future. And I see this as an inevitability of the technology that we already have and something that we need to brace for and prepare. So I think it's really great that I get to talk to you about it today. Volatility risks and fiat and crypto, I mean, that's a discussion for... I mean, it's a huge discussion whether you have faith in the underlying US dollar, for example. I think that's the key thing. Do you believe the US dollar is going to be relevant in the next 20 years? If yes, then I guess we're going to go with fiat. If you think it's going to be Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency, then I guess we're going to go with that.
Sorry, are you operational at the moment? Or is this conceptual?
So the actual chain is operational for remittance services, but the marketplace and escrow aspects of it, they were supposed to have been delivered last week, but the plan is to get it deployed this month.
All right. Thank you. It was a very lively discussion.